This is Cole from Cole's Quilts. Have you ever wondered what are all these different threads that you see at the quilt store? There are so many. Cotton, polyester, there are numbers, there are metallics, there's embroidery thread. I'm going to go over today what are some things that you need to know about thread if you want to try out some different thread other than your standard all-purpose thread. I first got into the rabbit hole of researching thread when I first got into free motion quilting, and I was doing a lot of free motion quilting on really small designs, and I felt like the designs looked sort of messy, and had this moment where I thought, well, if I'm doing small designs, I feel like if I had thinner thread, it would look a little bit nicer. And then I thought, do they make thinner thread? And so I started researching it. And that's how I sort of became obsessed with thread. Once I bought a long arm, that obsession, of course, became even more intense, because when you're free motion quilting and long arming, the type of thread you use is much more important than when you're piecing. Thread is important when you're piecing, but there are a lot of cases where you can just get away with whatever all-purpose thread when you're piecing, whereas when you're using a long arm, that's not the case because the machine's moving so fast. You have to have really strong thread. I grabbed some of my threads so we could talk about some of these examples. First thing that you want to know is that threads have a weight number. I'm going to sort of explain that number to you and show you some examples. So basically, it's sort of like when you get a piercing and you're like gauging your ears. The smaller the number, the bigger it is. So this, for example, is a very extreme example. This is something that you wouldn't like really even probably be able to fit in a regular sewing machine needle. This is an 8 weight thread. So this is very decorative. So this might be used for like some hand stitching, or sometimes thicker threads will be called like top stitch threads. Whereas this is where we get into more of like size of thread looks like something you could sew or quilt with. And this is a 40 weight. So 40 weight is usually the largest or thickest you're going to see used for sewing or quilting with a machine. Whereas on the other end, you have something as thin as 100 weight. A 100 weight thread is so fine, and often I'll use gray. Sometimes when I'm trying to thread the needle, it's like, it feels impossible to thread the needle, or it's hard to like find the thread. Why would I choose one weight over the other? So other than my example that I already gave you, let's say that you're quilting a quilt and you want the quilting to sort of fall into the background. You don't want it to distract from the quilt. Using a very fine thread, especially in something like this, like a medium or light gray, once you quilt it, it almost disappears. You can hardly see it. Whereas if I really want to see my quilting, something like a 40 weight is going to be a little bit better. Another thing to consider is, what is the thread made of? Is it cotton thread or is it polyester thread? I feel like a lot of really traditional quilters sort of have the opinion that, cotton or bust has to be cotton. Once you get into things like long arm and free motion quilting, then I feel like you'll get some different opinions. And the reason why is because polyester thread is a little bit stronger. And when you are long arming, that machine is moving really fast. The needle's bigger. It's a stronger machine. If you don't have a thread that's really strong and has a little bit of stretch to it, it will often break when you're trying to sew. So a lot of long armers will use polyester thread because the polyester thread is strong. One concern that I've sometimes heard people say is that if you use polyester thread with cotton fabrics, that over years, I'm talking like 50, 60 years, that the strength of the polyester thread will start sort of cutting up the fabric and it will fall apart sooner. As far as I know, there is some truth to that. However, we're talking again, 60, 70 years way in the future. So if that is a big concern to you, there are some really high quality cotton threads, but I would not avoid using polyester thread. I like using both of them. It just depends on the situation. Some of the examples that I have for you, this first one, the finest thread example I have here, is by Wonderfill, and this is called Invisifill, and this is a 100 weight. So this is super, super fine thread. I'm sure you probably can't even see it when I'm holding up here, but I'll post another picture example comparing them. So it's a super fine thread. This one is polyester, but some of these companies will prepare the polyester in a way where it acts more like cotton, and that is the case for the Invisifill. Another thing you'll notice is that sometimes thinner threads will be marketed as bobbin threads, And the reason for that is because there are a lot of people, a lot of quilters out there that will use maybe like an all-purpose thread for their top thread and then a finer thread for their bobbin thread. And what that does is it reduces the bulk when you're piecing, which I have been completely converted to that. This thread is an example of that. Look at the size of this cone. You would think this is going to last me forever, but it probably won't. Honestly, I use it all the time. This is by Superior Threads, and this is called Bottom Line because it's designed essentially to be a bobbin thread, but I also quilt with this as a top thread. And this sort of light gray color is perfect for quilting where you want the quilting to just disappear into the quilt. I also use it for a bobbin thread. It is a 60 weight, so it's still very thin. An all-purpose thread is usually going to be around a 50, so this is thinner than an all-purpose thread. And this is polyester, so you would think with it being so thin, like my first concern was, is it going to be strong enough to hold the pieces together? And let me tell you, yes, it is. It's a very strong thread. More like all-purpose. So these two are an example of something that would be a little bit more all-purpose. These are both 50 weight. This one is by Superior Threads. It's called So Fine. And this is a 50 weight that is polyester. And I use this for my long arm, whereas this is called Masterpiece. And this is a 50 weight cotton. And so this is what I use for piecing. You could switch that up. But again, on my long arm, I really like using the strong polyester threads. It's right in the middle here. So it's not going to really stand out, but it's not going to disappear. So it's sort of middle of the road for quilting. A lot of times when people are piecing, I feel like people will try to pick a color that matches their fabric to piece. Now, with what I do, I can't even do that because my quilts, it's like I'm sewing together a million different pieces of a million different colors. So there's no way I could match the color. I can't change my thread that fast. I will usually use a medium gray or a light gray or a sort of tan sort of color like this that will pretty much blend in with most things when I'm piecing. This is a line by Superior Threads called King Tut. King Tut is a 40 weight. So now all of these that I'm going to talk about are 40 weight. So 40 weight is going to be probably one of the thickest threads that you're going to use that's going to fit in a regular sewing machine needle. That's going to pop a little bit more. You're going to see it. It's going to be a little bit more obvious. So this is 3-ply Egyptian cotton. And by the way, I teach long arming classes. I teach free motion quilting classes. And people often ask me, does the thread brand matter? What are the good threads? Yada, yada. And basically what I tell them is until I got into free motion quilting and long arming, I would just buy all-purpose thread from Joann's, whatever was on sale. And it worked. It was fine. But once I started doing free motion and long arming, that didn't work because the threads will break and the threads will shred. And that's when I realized there really is a big difference between high quality thread and sort of middle of the range or lower quality thread. So Superior Threads is my personal favorite, but Wonderfil is also amazing. Glide is great. A lot of long armers love Glide thread. And then Aurifil, of course, Aurifil is wonderful too. But most of my quilting, as you can see here, is Superior Threads. So the King Tut, also their lines will be separated into like whether it's variegated or not. So like the King Tut threads are variegated, but then they also have ones that are just regular solids. But then they have this line called Fantastico. And this is one of my absolute favorite lines. So Fantastico is 40 weight. So it's the same as the King Tut, but it's polyester. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Hopefully you can see the shine on it. It is beautiful, shiny threads. It looks more like an embroidery type of thread. So I like to use this thread when I want the light to reflect off of my thread more when I'm quilting. And the Fantastico lines is variegated. They have, I think, Magnifico is their line that's not variegated. They have so many different beautiful colors. This one is sort of a variegated cream and tan, which is really great because it can work with lots of different colors. Here's an example of metallic thread. So this is a Wonderfil metallic thread. One thing that I want to point out about metallic thread, it's very appealing because it's so shiny and you're like, oh gosh, this looks so cool. This would be so fun to quilt with. The first time I tried to free motion quilt with a metallic thread, it was kind of a disaster. And one of the reasons why is because if you feel the metallic thread, it's sort of like the metallic-y part is wound around the outside, and so it doesn't feel as smooth. And what can happen is this thread can catch on the needle, very easily, and then it will shred or it will break. The great thing is that they actually make needles specifically for metallic thread, and the hole of the needle is sort of elongated, and it makes it easier for the thread to slide through the needle without it breaking. You can get yourself some metallic thread needles, and that will make this a lot easier. Now, long arm needles are bigger than needles if you're free motion quilting on your domestic machine, so it's a little bit less of an issue. But something to keep in mind when you're doing something like free motion or long arming is that you need the thread to be able to slide through the needle. And so when you're choosing different thread sizes, be aware you might need to change your needle size. As a general rule, when you put your thread through the eye of the needle, it should only take up about 40% of that hole. So if the thread is filling up the entire hole of the needle, then it'll probably break or shred once you start trying to quilt with it. So you might need a bigger needle. Sometimes when I've been teaching classes, people are like, this needle looks so big. And I'm like, trust me, you just want to go with the bigger needle. The last thread I want to talk about is Omni by Superior Threads. They also have a line called, I think, Omni V, which is their variegated. I almost think I use this more than anything else when I'm quilting. It's 40 weight, so it's the thickest. It's polyester, so it's strong. And it's like I have a lot of color of these, and this is, again, for when I want to see it. So you're really going to see the stitches. You're going to see the color pop when you're using this thread. When it comes down to it, you probably want to have a variety. If you're piecing, I would suggest 50 or 60 to piece because you don't want it to be super bulky, but you want it to be strong. When you're quilting, you want to have a thread that's strong. So a good polyester or cotton, either one. Oh, one other thing I want to point out about the difference between polyester and cotton. Cotton's going to be a little bit better, like long-term for an heirloom quilt, but lint. When I'm long arming, each time I change my bobbin, I brush out the underside of my long arm and get all the lint out. When I'm using polyester thread, there's a little bit of lint. When I use cotton thread, I often have to stop and brush out the lint 2 to 3 times before I'm even changing my bobbin again. So that's another thing to consider, but it's a great thread. In the end, I think the idea here is that if you haven't tried playing around with thread, please try playing around with thread. Find out what brands you like, what types you like. Remember the weight of the thread. The smaller the number, the thicker it is. The higher the number, the thinner it is. And polyester and cotton are both great threads. It just depends on if you're getting a good brand and what you're using it for. Thanks for watching.